My name is Daniel Cross, and for the past 11 months, I have been the only sworn officer assigned to a settlement called Catcher Point, a place that sits where the road stops and the tundra begins. I did not come here for purpose or pride. I came because nowhere else would take me after the divorce, and because the bonus for isolation looked like a way to outrun debt and silence that followed me south. That was the plan, simple and practical, until the nights started changing how I understood simple things like distance and sound and people. Catcher Point has a population that shifts with the seasons, just over 300 in summer, fewer than 200 once the dark settles in and the flights become unreliable. There is a store, a clinic, a fuel depot, and a council building that doubles as everything else. My station is a converted shed attached to a cabin that hums constantly from a heater that never quite warms the corners. The last officer left before finishing his contract. The paperwork said stress. Nobody here uses that word, but they all understood what it meant. Most days are quiet in a way that feels earned. I check on elders, settle arguments that burn out as quickly as they start, and drive the same narrow roads until they feel like grooves worn into my mind. Backup is a plane ride away, and only if the weather allows it. Out here, decisions do not wait for confirmation. You act, or you accept whatever happens next. That part I understood early. What I did not understand was how quickly the place itself would start to feel like it was watching those decisions with me. The darkness arrives slowly and then all at once. First the days shorten, then they flatten into gray, and then one morning you realize the sun is gone entirely. Not hidden, not delayed, just gone. The town becomes a small island of light, surrounded by something that feels thicker than night. Your eyes adjust, but your instincts do not. You start noticing shapes where there are none, movement where nothing should move. And after a while, you stop being certain that the mistake is always yours. About a month into my first winter, I started keeping a notebook. Not official reports, just observations. Times, sounds, things that did not fit. It began as a way to stay sharp, to give structure to long hours. But the entries changed. They became less about what happened, and more about what I could not explain. That shift is harder to admit than it sounds. There is a point where writing something down makes it feel real in a way that thinking it never does. The first case I am going to tell you about came in as something ordinary. A call from the store owner, Marla, who has lived here longer than most of the buildings. She said there was a man outside who did not belong. In a city, that means nothing. Here, it means everything. Visitors announce themselves without realizing it, just by existing in a place where everyone else is already accounted for. This man had been standing in the same spot for nearly half an hour. I drove over, expecting the usual explanations. Lost worker, delayed transport, someone who underestimated the cold. My headlights found him immediately. He stood about 20 feet from the entrance, facing the store, hands at his sides. No hat, no gloves, just a thin jacket that would not last 10 minutes in that temperature. The air was sharp enough to punish exposed skin within seconds. He did not react to the light or the engine, or me stepping out. When I approached, he turned his head slowly, like he had been expecting me, but had no reason to hurry. His face was flushed from the cold, but not in the way I had seen before. There was no strain in it, no tightening around the eyes or mouth. He looked comfortable, which was the first thing that felt wrong. People do not look comfortable at 30 below. They endure it. They fight it. He simply stood there, as if the temperature did not apply to him. I identified myself and asked if he needed help. He considered the question longer than necessary, then said he was waiting. His voice was calm, steady, without the slight shake that cold forces into your lungs. I asked who he was waiting for. He glanced past me toward the road, then back at the building, and said, "Not for anyone inside." It was precise in a way that made the answer less useful than silence. I brought him inside, because procedure leaves little room for interpretation in that kind of weather. Marla poured coffee and watched us through the reflection in the window. The man held the cup, but did not drink. He turned it slowly in his hands, like he recognized it from somewhere, but could not place it. I asked for his name. He gave me one, then hesitated when I asked for another. It was not confusion. It was as if the question did not connect. There is a difference between someone who cannot answer and someone who doesn't fit the answer. I have dealt with both. This man belonged to the second category. Every question I asked seemed to land slightly to the side of whatever he was experiencing. He responded politely, even thoughtfully, but nothing anchored him to anything I could verify. No origin, no destination, no urgency. Just the sense that he was in transit through something I could not see. I arranged for him to stay the night at the clinic, mostly because there was nowhere else to put him, and because leaving him outside was not an option I was willing to consider. The nurse on rotation, Elise, gave him a full check, while I waited in the hallway, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights and the wind pushing against the walls. When she came back out, her expression was controlled, but not neutral. She said his vitals were normal. Not just stable, normal. No signs of hypothermia, no frostbite. Nothing that explained how long he might have been outside. It was the kind of report that should have been reassuring, except it wasn't. I locked the room myself. Not because I thought he was dangerous, but because procedure matters more in places like this, where the margin for error is already thin. The window was too small for anyone to pass through, and there was only one door. I remember checking the latch twice, then standing there for a moment longer than necessary, listening. He had already laid down, blanket pulled up, eyes closed like someone settling into a routine night. There was no resistance, no questions, no indication that anything about the situation felt unusual to him. By morning, he was gone. The door was still locked. I know that because I had to unlock it myself when Elise called me back. The room looked untouched. The bed was neat, the blanket folded at the foot, like he had taken the time to leave it that way. There were no marks on the walls, no signs of forced exit, no disturbance of any kind. The window was exactly as it had been, sealed and rimmed with frost. Outside, fresh snow had covered everything in a smooth, uninterrupted layer. No tracks leading away, no impressions near the building. It was as if he had never needed to leave at all. I filed the report because that is what you do when something refuses to fit. You document it, you send it up the chain, and you accept that the answer may never come back down. The response I got was predictable. Possible mental health case, transient, likely wandered off before snowfall intensified. It was clean, reasonable, and completely disconnected from what I had seen with my own eyes. I did not argue. There are limits to what can be explained over a radio without sounding like you have already lost control of the situation. For a few days, the town absorbed it the way it absorbs most things, quietly. People asked small questions, then stopped asking altogether. It was not fear exactly. It was closer to recognition, like hearing a distant sound you have heard before and choosing not to follow it. I noticed that pattern, but I did not understand it yet. I thought it was just how isolated communities function, conserving attention for things that can be fixed. The second case began about 3 weeks later, and it did not come in over the radio. I found it myself. I was running a late patrol along the shoreline road, the one that eventually dissolves into packed snow and then into nothing at all. It is the kind of route you take less for duty and more to remind yourself that the world still exists beyond the walls of your cabin. The sky was clear enough to show stars, and the aurora was faint, stretching thin green lines across the horizon. My headlights carved a narrow path ahead, everything outside of it reduced to absence. I heard the sound before I understood it. At first, I thought it was the ice shifting, because that is constant out here. It cracks, it groans, it settles in ways that feel almost alive if you listen too closely. But this was different. It had rhythm. Slow, steady, spaced evenly enough that my mind tried to count it without being asked. I turned off the engine, and the silence that followed made the sound clearer. Not louder, just more complete. It filled the space in a way that made everything else feel like background noise. I stepped out of the truck and felt it through my boots before I fully registered it with my ears. A vibration, subtle but consistent, rising up from the direction of the frozen ocean. It settled into my chest in a way that made me aware of my own heartbeat, as if the two were trying to align. That is the closest I can come to describing it without overstating what happened. It did not feel aggressive. It did not feel like a warning. It simply existed, steady and patient. I walked closer to the edge of the ice, telling myself that I needed a better angle to identify the source. That is how decisions get made out here. You attach them to a practical reason and move forward before the doubt has time to catch up. The surface was uneven, ridged from previous shifts, but solid under my weight. The sound did not change as I moved. It remained constant, unaffected by distance in a way that made it difficult to place. There is a moment in situations like that where training and instinct stop agreeing with each other. Training tells you to withdraw, to reassess from safety, to avoid unnecessary risk. Instinct tells you to stay, because leaving without understanding feels worse than the danger itself. I stood there longer than I should have, listening, trying to categorize something that did not belong to any category I knew. Then it stopped. Not gradually, not fading out the way natural sounds do. It ended in the middle of its own rhythm, as if something had interrupted it. The absence that followed was sharper than the sound had been. I waited, expecting it to return, but it didn't. The ordinary noises of the ice came back slowly, filling the space it had occupied. But they felt thinner somehow, less convincing. I went back to the truck and drove into town without turning the radio on. The silence inside the cab felt different after that, like it was holding something in place. That night, I wrote everything down in the notebook. Not just the sound, but the way it felt, the way it seemed to settle into me. I told myself it was just documentation, just a record for later reference. But the act of writing it made it harder to dismiss. Over the next week, I asked around carefully. Not direct questions, just enough to see if anyone else had noticed something similar. Most people gave general answers about the ice always making noise this time of year. But when I described the rhythm, the consistency, the way it seemed to come from beneath, rather than across the surface, the responses changed. Conversations ended sooner. Eye contact broke faster. It was not denial. It was avoidance, deliberate and practiced. One of the fishermen, a man named Eric, finally gave me something closer to an answer. He did not lower his voice or lean in like he was sharing a secret. He spoke normally, which made it easier to listen. He said that some winters the ice talks, and some winters it doesn't. He did not explain what that meant, and I did not ask him to. There was a sense that the explanation would not help me, only place me inside something I was not ready to stand in. That was the point where I stopped thinking of the first incident as isolated. Patterns do not announce themselves all at once. They build quietly, one detail at a time, until ignoring them takes more effort than acknowledging them. A man appears where he should not be, leaves without leaving, and then the ground itself starts producing something that behaves like intention without having one. I started noticing smaller things after that. People pausing before stepping onto the ice, even when conditions were safe. Doors being checked twice at night, not out of habit, but out of something closer to caution. Conversations that shifted direction when certain topics came too close to the surface. It was not fear. It was adjustment, like a community aligning itself around something unspoken. And for the first time since I arrived, I had the distinct sense that I was the only one who did not understand the rules I was already living under. The third case did not come in as a call either. It came as a request, quiet and indirect. passed to me through the council the way certain concerns are handled when nobody wants to give them a formal shape. A man named Peter Halleck had not been seen in nearly 3 weeks. That alone was not unusual. People here keep to themselves in ways that would feel extreme anywhere else. But Peter had a pattern, and patterns matter more than schedules in places like this. He came into town every 10 days, sometimes 12 at most. Always for the same supplies, always at the same time of day. When that pattern broke, it did not cause alarm. It caused attention. His cabin sat about 6 miles north of town, past the last stretch of maintained road, and up along a ridge that overlooked the coast. The trail was still visible under the snow, but no recent tracks cut through it. I took a snowmobile out just after what passes for midday light, a dim gray that barely separates ground from sky. The air was still, which made the silence feel intentional, like something that had settled, rather than something that had always been there. The ride out gave me too much time to think, and my thoughts kept circling the same points: the man at the store, the sound under the ice, the way people avoided saying certain things directly. None of it formed a conclusion, but together they created a kind of pressure, like pieces of something that would only make sense once it was too late to matter. I focused on the trail instead, on keeping the machine steady over uneven ground, on the practical details that could still be controlled. Peter's cabin came into view slowly, emerging from the flat white like it had been placed there after everything else was decided. It was well built, solid in a way that suggested long-term intent, rather than temporary shelter. No smoke came from the chimney. That was the first sign that something was wrong, though not the worst. In this cold, a fire is not optional. It is constant, or it is the beginning of the end. I cut the engine and listened. Nothing moved. No shifting wood, no distant machinery, no indication that anything inside or around the cabin was active. I approached the door and knocked, announcing myself out of habit more than expectation. The sound of my knuckles against the wood felt too loud, like it did not belong in the quiet that surrounded it. I waited, then knocked again. Still nothing. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was cold enough to see my breath, but not as cold as it should have been if the place had been empty for long. The stove was dead, its contents settled into a gray stillness that told me it had not been lit in days, maybe longer. The room itself was orderly, not staged, not cleaned for appearance, just maintained. A table, a chair, a narrow bed, shelves with supplies, arranged in a way that made sense only to the person who used them regularly. There were no signs of struggle, no disruption that suggested anything sudden or violent. That absence should have been reassuring. Instead, it made everything feel incomplete, like a sentence that had been cut off before the verb. I checked the rest of the cabin, the small storage area, the loft, the perimeter outside. Nothing. No tracks, no discarded gear, no indication that Peter had left in a way that could be followed. Then, I noticed the table. A mug sat near the edge, its contents frozen solid. A thin layer of ice formed across the top that had cracked slightly as the temperature shifted over time. The chair was pulled back at an angle, not knocked over, not pushed aside in urgency, just moved enough to suggest that someone had stood up from it. It was an ordinary scene, the kind you would not look at twice under normal circumstances. But here, in that silence, it felt like evidence of something precise. Peter had been sitting there, drinking something hot, in a space he understood, with everything he needed within reach. And then, for some reason, he had stood up and walked out. His outer gear was still hanging by the door. Heavy coat, insulated pants, boots, gloves. Everything necessary to survive more than a few minutes outside. He had not taken any of it. That fact settled in slowly, the way cold does when it seeps through layers you thought were enough. People do not step outside like that here. Not by accident, not by choice. There are no distractions strong enough to override that kind of instinct. I stepped back outside and widened my search, moving in a slow circle around the cabin, scanning for any disturbance in the snow. The surface was smooth, recently settled, covering anything older than a few days. If he had left earlier than that, the trail would be gone. But there was nothing fresh either. No sign that anyone had approached or departed since the last snowfall. I radioed the situation in, keeping my description as clear and simple as possible. Missing person, no signs of forced exit, environmental risk high. The response was immediate but limited. A search team would be assembled, but weather conditions would dictate timing. That is how it works here. Urgency exists, but it moves within constraints that do not care about it. Before I left, I stood in the doorway and looked back at the table one more time. There is a difference between seeing something and understanding it. I saw the mug, the chair, the arrangement of the room. I understood the sequence of actions that must have occurred. What I did not understand was the cause, the moment that shifted a man from sitting safely inside to stepping into conditions that would kill him within minutes. On the ride back, the light faded quickly, collapsing into the kind of darkness that feels immediate rather than gradual. My headlight picked out the trail, but everything beyond it felt closer than before, as if the distance between visible and invisible had shortened. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, trying to find something I had missed, some detail that would anchor it to a known explanation. Halfway back, I stopped. I did not plan to stop. There was no obstacle, no sound that forced the decision. Something about the silence changed, just enough to make continuing feel like ignoring something important. I killed the engine, and for a moment, there was nothing. Then slowly, I felt it again. The same rhythm. It rose up from the direction of the coast, faint at first, then clearer as I stood there listening. The vibration settled into the ground, into the machine beneath me, into my body in a way that made it impossible to separate from my own awareness. It was identical to what I had heard before, unchanged in tempo, unchanged in presence. That consistency was what unsettled me the most. Natural things vary. This did not. I looked north without meaning to. There was nothing to see, just darkness layered over distance. But the direction felt defined in a way that did not require visual confirmation. The sound did not pull me physically. It did not compel movement in any obvious sense. But it created a focus, a narrowing of attention that made everything else feel less relevant. I thought about Peter then, about the chair, the mug, the door left closed behind him. I tried to place myself in that moment, to imagine what could override every instinct that keeps a person alive in this environment. And for a brief second, standing there with that steady pulse moving through the ground, I understood something I did not want to understand. It would not feel like a mistake. That realization was enough to break whatever hold the moment had on me. I started the snowmobile and turned back toward town without looking north again. The sound continued for a while, fading not in volume but in relevance as distance increased, until it was gone in the same abrupt way I had experienced before. The search for Peter lasted 9 days. Volunteers, coordinated sweeps, dogs brought in from another settlement. Nothing. No tracks, no remains, no indication of direction. It was as if the land had absorbed him without disturbance. The official conclusion was exposure, presumed fatal. It was the only conclusion that fit within the framework we use to keep things manageable. But frameworks have limits. After the search was called off, I went back to the cabin one last time, not as part of any official duty, just to stand in the space again and see if anything felt different. It didn't. The mug was still there, the chair still angled away from the table, the gear still hung untouched by the door. When I stepped outside, I looked toward the ridge that sloped down to the coast. For a moment, I thought I saw something in the distance. A shape, darker than the surrounding snow, standing still against the horizon. I focused on it, trying to resolve it into something identifiable. But the longer I looked, the less certain I became. Distance plays tricks here, especially in low light. Shapes shift, edges blur, and your mind fills in details that may not exist. I took a few steps forward, then stopped. The shape was gone. No movement, no transition, just absence where something had been a second before. I stood there longer than I should have, scanning the area, waiting for some sign that would confirm or deny what I thought I had seen. Nothing came. As I turned back toward the cabin, the sound began again, low and steady, rising from the direction I had just been watching. It lasted only a few seconds this time, just long enough to settle into my awareness before cutting off completely. I did not go back after that. In the weeks that followed, the town shifted in ways that were subtle enough to deny if you were not paying attention, and obvious enough to unsettle you if you were. The sun began to return, first as a suggestion along the horizon, then as a thin line of color that lasted a few minutes longer each day. People talked more, doors opened faster, there was movement where there had been stillness. On the surface, everything pointed toward relief. Underneath, nothing had changed. I started sleeping with the radio on, not for noise, but for the reminder that there were still systems in place, still voices that operated within rules I understood. Even then, I would wake up at times I could not place, unsure if I had heard something external, or if my mind had simply replayed the memory of that rhythm enough times to make it feel present. The difference stopped mattering after a while. Whether it was real in the moment or remembered did not change how it felt. I spoke to one of the elders, a woman named Annika, not because I expected answers, but because she had a way of listening that made silence feel like part of the conversation instead of the end of it. I told her about the cases. The man at the store, the cabin, the sound. I did not frame them as connected. I did not need to. She understood the connection before I finished. She did not explain things in a way that would translate into a report. There were no clear definitions, no boundaries I could map. She spoke about the land as if it had memory, not in a literal sense, but in the way patterns repeat when conditions allow them to. She said there are times when those patterns become easier to step into, whether you intend to or not. I asked her what that meant in practical terms, what someone is supposed to do with information like that. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. You pay attention, she said, and when something tells you not to go somewhere, you listen. It was not the kind of guidance I was trained to work with. It did not prevent anything. It did not resolve anything. It simply acknowledged that there are limits to what can be controlled, and that survival sometimes depends on recognizing those limits before you test them. Spring came slowly, stretching the days into something that resembled normalcy. The ice began to break apart along the coast, large sections shifting and separating with sounds that carried for miles. It was loud, chaotic, and familiar in a way that made it easier to accept than the quiet rhythm I had heard before. Noise you can attribute to cause, silence or something that moves within it is harder to assign. I let myself believe, for a short time, that whatever had happened during the deep winter was over, that it belonged to a specific set of conditions that no longer existed. That belief did not come from evidence, it came from need. People require endings, even if they have to create them. That illusion held until the day the fishermen called me out to the water. They had found something on one of the larger ice floes, drifting just beyond the break line. It was not unusual for debris to surface during that time of year. Equipment lost, objects carried out, and then returned by shifting currents. I expected something along those lines, something that would fit into a category I could process and document. When I got there, the sky was clear in a way that made everything look sharper than it should have. The water was dark, almost still between the moving ice. They guided me closer to what they had seen, and for a moment I did not understand what I was looking at. It was a pair of boots. They were placed side by side near the center of the ice, aligned carefully, toes pointed toward open water to the north. There were no tracks leading to them, no marks indicating how they had been set there, just the boots, dry and intact, resting on a surface that had been breaking apart for days. I stepped onto the ice carefully, aware of the movement beneath it, aware of the distance between where I stood and anything that could be called stable ground. The boots looked older at first glance, worn in a way that suggested long use, but when I picked one up, the leather felt soft, almost new. There was no moisture, no salt residue, nothing that indicated exposure to the conditions around it. For a moment, I thought of the man from the store. Not because I had proof, but because the detail fit too closely to ignore. The same kind of boots, the same absence of explanation, the same sense that whatever had happened did not follow the sequence of events I would expect. No one spoke while I examined them. The fishermen watched in a way that told me they did not need me to confirm anything for them. They already understood enough to leave the rest alone. That silence felt heavier than any question they could have asked. I brought the boots back with me. I did not log them immediately. I set them on the top shelf of a storage closet in my office, behind a stack of unused files, and closed the door. There was no protocol for what they represented, no category that would make their presence easier to process. Sometimes delaying a decision is the only way to keep it from becoming something you cannot manage. That night, the town was quiet in a way that felt different from before. Not empty, not tense, just settled. I sat in my cabin and listened to the heater cycle on and off, the same mechanical rhythm repeating at predictable intervals. It was a relief to hear something that behaved the way it was supposed to. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Faint, almost indistinguishable at first, but consistent enough that I knew it was not the heater, not the wind, not anything I could easily dismiss. The same slow pulse, rising through the floor, through the structure of the building, into the space I occupied. It did not grow louder. It did not need to. It was already where it needed to be. I stayed where I was. There was no part of me that considered going outside. Understanding is not always about gathering more information. Sometimes it is about recognizing when you have enough to know what not to do. The sound continued for a while, long enough for me to lose track of how long I had been sitting there listening. And then, as before, it stopped without transition. The absence it left behind felt complete, like something had closed rather than faded. I did not write it down that night. There was nothing new to add, nothing that would change the pattern that had already established itself. A man appears and disappears without trace. Another leaves safety without reason and is never found. The ground itself produces something that behaves like intention but offers no explanation. And when it ends, it leaves behind objects that suggest continuation rather than conclusion. I still have the boots. Sometimes I take them out and look at them, not to find answers, but to confirm that they are still there, still unchanged. They have not aged. They have not deteriorated. They remain exactly as they were the day I found them, as if time applies differently to them than it does to everything else around them. I signed on for another year. The official reason is the same as before: the pay, the isolation, the lack of alternatives that make sense. But there is something else now, something I do not include in reports or conversations. A sense that leaving would not remove me from what I have experienced, only separate me from the place where it made a kind of sense. Out here, there are edges you learn to recognize, even if you cannot define them, places where your understanding stops and something else begins. You do not cross those edges. You do not test them. You acknowledge them and you adjust. Most nights are quiet, but sometimes, when everything settles and the town feels like it is holding its breath, I can still feel that faint, steady pulse beneath the floor. And when it comes, I stay exactly where I am and wait for it to pass, because whatever is out there does not need me to come closer. So far, it hasn't asked twice.